That's a really unique experience for me. I've known this woman about 50 years or more. But it's another dimension. Thank you very much. I appreciate what you said. Now, it's my job to cross-examine and talk to our guest speaker. But before introducing him, I'd like to acknowledge that we have sponsors. None of this happened by chance. Medical Services and LeadCom. And it's a privilege to facilitate today's event, today's luncheon, which everyone, people like these luncheons very much. I also want to acknowledge a number of guests who are here today. Karl Hartleb, Austrian Consulate General, Ratu Oriol Ravuso from the Fiji Consulate, Ronaldo Aquino, Contractor, Department of Attorney General's Department of Justice, Glenn Robinson, Director, Asia Advisory, AFG Venture Group, Tom Switzer. Tom's not here yet, I don't think. Is he? Oh, there he is. He's being very quiet, Tom. Nice to see you. Alison, she needs no introduction. Andrew West, host of Radio National ABC. And Jason Constable, Team Leader, Incoming, Community Engagement, Australian Federal Police, and my successor as President of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, Ian Lincoln, which is our leading foreign policy organisation, non-government organisation in Australia. At least it's the oldest one, and it's got chapters in every state. And finally, Paul Maliate, Treasurer of United Nations Association of Australia. Welcome all. Thank you very much. Now, our speaker is someone I've got quite a bit of empathy with, because he went through Stanford Law School, got his degree, got admitted to the American bar, but never practiced. I got admitted in Adelaide to the South Australian Supreme Court and never practiced. We went in different directions. Another connection is that Doug, as an aide to President Reagan, says he knows Dr. Helen Caldicott vaguely, but not really very well. And Helen Caldicott started the Physicians for Social Responsibility in the United States, very anti-nuclear. She went to see Ronald Reagan and she was appalled, she said, at his lack of knowledge about nuclear weapons. And yet Ronald Reagan at Reykjavik was almost epoch-making in declaring with the Soviet Union the abolition of nuclear weapons. Jim Wilkinson, one of his associate staff members, persuaded Reagan all the way home on the plane not to do something so foolish, and it didn't happen. Anyway, Helen Caldicott, who is my sister, she's still alive and well. I'm sure she would like to meet Doug. Doug is a senior fellow president at the Cato Institute and a former special assistant to President Reagan, previously affiliated with the Heritage Foundation. This is all very right-wing. And Competitive Enterprise Institute. Is spending February as scholar in residence in the Centre for Independent Studies in Sydney, of which Tom Switzer is the major moving intellectual. Doug writes a weekly column for the American Conservative Online, previously a columnist for Forbes, a nationally syndicated columnist with Copley News Services, an editor of the monthly political magazine Inquiry, has been widely published in such periodicals as Foreign Policy, Orbis, National Interest, Time, Newsweek and Fortune. Also with New York Times and Wall Street Journal and Washington Post. Written several books, including Foreign Follies, America's New Global Empire, Tripwire, Career in the US Foreign Policy in a Changed World. By gosh, is it a tripwire? It's probably less of one than it used to be, because the United States have withdrawn their forces from Camp Casey, which was about a spit from the 38th parallel, so that tripwire is much further south now. And with this new president that we have, who would have thought that Donald Trump would actually have two meetings, not one but two, with Kim Jong-un at a summit? And it hasn't led anywhere yet, because it seems to me, Doug, and we can unpack this further, if the United States would only come at a level playing field and sit at the table and say, we'll do incremental things together, it might work. They're not doing that. Anyway, so Doug received his Bachelor of Science in Economics from Florida, and his J.D. from Stanford University in 1979, a member of the California and Washington bars. So please join me in giving Doug Bandow a warm welcome. Thank you.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Richard. I want to thank Ahmed and the Foundation for bringing me in to give the talk. It's very nice to have the opportunity to meet as many people as possible and to discuss important issues like this. And thank you for our two kind of co-hosts, I suppose, of what the right word is, but I appreciate both of you. It's been very nice to meet you and as well as to have your participation. I want to thank Tom, because I'm here courtesy of the Center for Independent Studies. It's the only reason I'm here in Sydney, and it's given me a wonderful opportunity to meet people here. Richard, you'd be happy to know that Heritage fired me because of my work on foreign policy. So don't worry that the universe came back into balance on that one. But it's quite a time to be thinking and talking about China. That, of course, an interesting story is that originally it was complicated logistics. I was actually going to be flying here via Air China via Beijing. And a couple of weeks before I left, I decided maybe that was not the best route, and we had to kind of change things so I could actually make it here and not end up in quarantine. So that has certainly taken the attention of what's going on in China today, but there are an awful lot of other issues out there that matter. And what I'll do is fairly briefly run through what I see some of the important issues, and then we'll have a discussion and we'll have questions from you all. China obviously matters. It clearly matters to Australia and Asia. At some level, if you're thinking of national power, these days you're thinking of China and the others. That sense of the looming colossus. And that makes it very different from Europe. Russia simply is not the looming colossus today. Soviet Union was more so, it's not Russia today. So if you look at China, however, the potential, at least, of theory of China being a dominant power and using that dominance for ill is there, I think, in very important ways. And you here in Australia have had a lot of discussions about Chinese influence, the whole question about economic connections, the role of students coming. There's a lot there, obviously, and many of those same issues, actually, the U.S. has had some of those same discussions. For the United States, China is a huge economic partner. And for Americans who are used to dominating the world, or at least their country dominating the world, China is the one potential peer competitor. Again, people who tell me Russia's a great threat, I just have trouble taking that seriously. Putin's a bad guy, but I just don't see Russia running rampant around the globe trying to dominate in a way one can imagine a China being essentially equal to the United States. And that has taken very much a question of American foreign policy and military policy, and that dominates a lot of thinking in Washington. And as you can imagine, that has huge ramifications if you start thinking about that kind of a competition, and that's certainly what Washington sees. And the world beyond obviously matters. China is economically involved around the world, and a competition, especially a militarized competition, between the U.S. and China would be very dangerous. People talk about the Thucydides Trap. You go back to ancient Athens. The idea of Athens is the established power dealing with Sparta, the rising power, and the question is, how do you get through that kind of a dynamic without a conflict? And people see that today as the U.S. is the established power to some degree in decline. China is the rapidly rising power. Can you get through this period? And I think we have to recognize how important it is to get through that period without conflict. And I would simply throw out, in the 1800s, in many ways, Britain, the United Kingdom, was the dominant power. Not quite the same. Never had the land power that the United States had, but dominated the oceans, the most colonies, economy, all of that there, and it faced two rising powers. It faced the United States, and it faced Wilhelmine Germany, or ultimately Wilhelmine Germany. And it basically became friend of, accommodated, accepted, and downplayed a rivalry with the United States, and that relationship in a positive way persists. And it confronted Germany, and it took 2 world wars to figure out how that all sorted out. And you, of course, Australia and New Zealand contributed to both those world wars, lost an awful lot of brave young men. Those sorts of conflicts radiate around the globe. No one in this room should want to have the 21st century, be the century of war between the United States and China. If that ever happened, I don't think it would be just one conflict. I think it would be more than one. It would be tragic. It'd be horrible. And the question, that really does put a premium then on how to keep the peace. And in terms of relationship, I think the danger now is that what we've seen going on in China and America's perception of that in particular, but also when I think Australia and others, Europeans, are sharing to some degree, is a China that was seen as somewhat benign, hopefully moving in a more Western direction, hopefully liberalizing because of economic connections. All of these things people had hoped for over recent decades is not the case today. What we see under Xi Jinping, I think, is radically different. I would argue, indeed, that in many ways we're moving back to Maoist totalitarianism. We're seeing personality cult, power of the party, centralization of power in Xi's hands, lots of repression. I mean, what you're seeing there then is a lot of, and that is really, I think, transforming the discussion of the relationship. That all the accepted assumptions, you find folks in the United States saying that America should isolate them, have nothing to do with them, that engagement has been a big mistake. And I mean, one can imagine going off in that direction, which I'd argue is quite dangerous, but that is the kind of discussion that's certainly evolving in Washington. As if you look today, first is failed political liberalization. I mean, Tiananmen Square is kind of the emblematic of that, but after that, I would argue, certainly until Xi took over, you had kind of loose authoritarianism. That is, people could, use VPNs and get around internet censorship. Academics could have kind of veiled conversations. My institute would meet with reform groups. We're always very careful. You don't attack the Chinese Communist Party, but there was a dialogue. There was activity. You get invited to universities. You didn't have to clear it in Beijing. I mean, a lot of stuff there, this feeling of a bit of looseness, as long as you didn't directly confront the party. And that is basically disappearing. What we're seeing is room for dissent within China is going in almost every way. In terms of internet, in terms of universities, now you have to get approval from Beijing. I actually showed up last year, invited to a conference in April in Shanghai. I get off the airplane the night before, I'm picked up, and he said, "Oh, bad news." It turns out, we were told yesterday by the local, kind of international department for Shanghai, that we actually had to get Beijing's approval for our foreign speakers. So you're going to be doing tourist stuff tomorrow. You're not participating in the conference. You're not giving the speech we arranged. And I wasn't the only one. And it turns out there are old rules now in force. So you're seeing this kind of pervasively. And you're seeing the human rights impact. I mean, Uyghurs, 1 million Uyghurs in re-education camps. Vocational training centers, we are told. Vocational training centers that have high walls, barbed wire, and armed guards. Very unique in my experience for vocational training centers. But, I mean, religious persecution is rife. I mean, basically a crackdown on almost all churches, physically destroying churches, throwing people in jail, demanding they put up pictures of Mao and Xi. I mean, this is a pervasive thing we're seeing in a lot of different areas. We also see, the question of international impact, so it's not just domestic repression, but it's a more aggressive China. And you can argue exactly how much is assertive and how much of aggressive, but we certainly see a China that today seems much more willing to push itself outward. We see that very dramatically in Hong Kong, which is technically part of China. I mean, we have to acknowledge that. On the other hand, what we're seeing there is clearly people who China views as part of China, but these are people who don't view themselves that way. And the Chinese government, in a sense, has given up any, kind of facade of caring particularly what they think, quite willing to use repression. Same thing on Taiwan. Greater pressure on Taiwan, a determination at some point Taiwan will be under, Beijing's control. We see the territorial disputes kind of throughout the region, in terms of pushing, and a lot of countries involved in this, of course, Vietnam, and this, we talk about the Philippines and Japan. I mean, these are widespread issues, that are out there. But in almost all of these, there's a sense of unease that China, growing wealthier, building a bigger military, kind of pushing itself out, while at the same time its domestic politics seems to be moving in a very bad direction. And there's a lot of economic issues, and that, of course, is what has transfixed the attention of the president of my country. And they're genuine issues and important issues. On the other hand, in many ways, they strike me as subsidiary issues. That is, some of the argument, I mean, our president gets transfixed over issues like the trade deficit, so his view is if you have a trade deficit, you're losing, even though you get stuff in return, for the payments. So that's kind of where he's been focused on. And there's a lot of question of how the president kind of sees that fitting in with issues of human rights and Hong Kong and territorial disputes, where he's so busy trying to do something on economics. Part of that's politics. He wants to get reelected later this year, and he has a lot of unhappy people who've lost as part of this trade war. But you have all of this going on at once. And what's really important, I think, from an American standpoint, is that traditionally economics was the strong foundation of the US-PRC relationship. So you always had critics. There were always people concerned about human rights, religious liberty, hawks on security issues. But you always had a large corporate community and a lot of people who were committed to this relationship because they believed that it was, in fact, economically profitable. And that has been breaking down. A lot more American companies view China as essentially cheating. They've seen forced transfers of technology. They see commercial espionage. They see a whole bunch of things. So for a lot of them, they're actually cheering the president on with a trade war. So you're finding today in the US, China has very few friends on right or left. And my guess is that this year it's going to be a presidential issue. Democrats will attack the president for being too friendly to China. And I don't know how he's going to respond. He could respond either, well, I got a trade agreement, this is wonderful, or he could go on the attack against China. So this could be a very, very difficult year, I think, for that relationship. On the other hand, I think it's also important thinking about these dangers is to recognize that there are reasons not to panic. Number one is China is growing in military, but China is hardly in a position to dominate the world. The challenge on the military side is that power is expensive to project. It's a lot cheaper to deter. And that's the focus for China. It doesn't have to have 11 carrier groups like the United States. It has to have the ability to sink carrier groups. If it can sink carriers, it's going to deter the United States from wanting to get involved. But the point is, China itself, the question of is it actually interested in overseas invasion and conquest and stuff, I think these are issues where we're not at that point yet. That China is growing economically, but it also remains a poor country. That is, if you look at per capita GDP, even before coronavirus, and I think the coronavirus, the economic impact here is huge. I mean, you have 80 cities or more under some form of quarantine, isolation. Hundreds of millions of people are limited in certain ways. You go to Beijing, you're supposed to self-quarantine for 2 weeks. I mean, imagine trying to run an economy that way. I mean, they send drones over Wuhan and other places. These are empty streets. So China faces a lot of challenges there that are going to have an impact. Demography. This is a society that risks growing old before it grows rich. In terms of the one-child policy has been ended, but fertility is not recovered. This is a society where you have essentially too few young people, an rapidly aging population. There are lots of issues here of weaknesses. You look at their own economic policies of very high indebtedness, state enterprises that are highly indebted, banks that hold lots of bad loans, ghost cities. There's a lot there. And this is a place that was slowing economically even before coronavirus. And for the party, slowing economy means political problems. If you have no particular legitimacy other than providing economic growth, and you stop providing economic growth, you have some problems. And I think the political system is also rather fragile. It strikes me that Xi Jinping is both on the precipice and at the mountaintop. And it's not clear what is he closer to. The point is, this is somebody who essentially has been presented as omnipresent, omnipotent. I mean, and suddenly they're not doing very well on the coronavirus. What does that mean? I mean, this is someone who has a centralized power, not just in the party, but in himself. And it really is a creation of a personality cult. You see his picture all over. You see, pictures of, the plates, the kind of decorative plates. I was in Hunan a couple of years ago at Mao's birthplace. And Mao, it's funny, his father was actually a fairly wealthy peasant. He actually has a nice little preserved home. And they had the usual gift shop. Had a stand which had all these Mao decorative plates. But in the middle, there was one plate bigger than any other plate. And it was not a Mao plate. It was a Xi plate. I mean, the point is what we're seeing, they're demanding that people put pictures of Xi Jinping up in churches. I mean, this is something where if things go badly, it's kind of hard to imagine how you get away from having to take the blame. And he's got a lot of problems there. Among other things, he's made a lot of enemies. As far as I can tell, the Chinese seem to think that if you just tell everybody, shut up and do what we think, they now suddenly are your supporters. But I like to tell them, there are actually 100 million Christians who hate you. You're closing their churches, you're blowing things up, you're despoiling. You actually think they like you? Get real. They know what they have to say to survive, and they go off and meet secretly. But you think they like you? Forget it. The moment they have an opportunity. And I think there are a lot of, they're kind of closet liberals and thinkers who are there. People Cato's worked with who are now out of work, out of jobs they were in, political enemies. Xi Jinping has, I think in many ways, dangerously taken on and kind of thrown out the old assumptions. He now has no term limit. He's gone after previous rulers. This is a man who is a real target. So China, I mean, this is a place where it's not at all clear to me that they are well positioned, for the future fight. So, and most importantly, is the future is not set. And this, I think, is where, in many ways, the greatest hope is, which is I don't think that the China we have today in any way is foreordained to be the China of tomorrow and decades later. Xi Jinping has made huge changes over the last 8 years. A new president, somebody else could take a very different direction, especially given political challenges. I mean, there are challenges the other way. I mean, a politics that goes very badly wrong, do you look outward as a means to try to build political support? But that's a very risky strategy. So I think that what we see today is an extraordinary challenge ahead. My emphasis in terms of the U.S. is not to treat China as an enemy, that to treat China as an enemy makes it much more likely to be one. To talk with countries in the region, the question of how to try to constrain, I hate the word contain, but at least constrain Chinese activism. I think that requires bringing in countries like India, Japan, building relationships, a security architecture here that is rooted within the region. And I think it requires understanding that America's willingness to intervene in the coming years cannot be assumed. I mean, the U.S. is functionally bankrupt. The U.S. has trillion U.S. dollar deficits every year. The U.S. has a $23 trillion accumulated deficit. It's more than 100% of GDP. The U.S. has $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities. That is promises made in American social and healthcare programs that there's no money coming in. In that world, the U.S. is going to face its own challenges in the year ahead, and those will inevitably have an impact on foreign policy. Your best hope, of course, is that the U.S. decides to give up on Europe and the Middle East. Then maybe you can keep them involved in Asia. But the expectation the U.S. can continue to dominate the world, and will do so, I think, is likely to be challenged at the polls. Donald Trump in certain ways, Bernie Sanders in others, and I think people to follow are likely to undercut these assumptions. There's a lot there on the table, so we can now move to